Ladies and gentlemen, the world we're living in today was created and shaped in the aftermath of the Second World War. From 1945 to 1949, the good guys divided up the world between them and laid down the geopolitical boundaries of the modern world order. A French Jew named René Cassin worked under a committee established by Eleanor Roosevelt to draft a document called the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaimed universal human dignity, the right to life, liberty, the security of every person, and so on. While this was being written, the largest mass expulsions in human history were being perpetrated by these selfsame good guys. An English lawyer named Radcliffe arbitrarily drew a line on a map, and about 14 million people in India found themselves on the wrong side of this line. As the former British colony was ripped in half, about 1 million people died trying to get into or out of the newly formed countries. At the same time, around 600 Palestinian villages were being demolished and depopulated in a series of atrocities that culminated in the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. Another 1 million innocent people, about half of Palestine's pre-war Arab population, found themselves expelled from their ancient homeland. And in occupied Europe, the largest and most brutal ethnic cleansing in human history was underway. I'm talking about the mass expulsion of 15 million Germans, mostly women, children, and the elderly, from lands which had been German for centuries. And around 3 million of these folks perished in the violence and chaos of this catastrophe, which was agreed on and decided upon between Churchill, Stalin, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his successor, Harry Truman, at Yalta and at Potsdam. Besides Germans, hundreds of thousands of others in Central and Eastern Europe were torn from their ancestral homelands by these senseless and arbitrary dictates, including the Poles in eastern Poland, whom France and England supposedly went to war in 1939 to protect. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because I want to make it absolutely clear that the winners of World War II had no problem and have no problem with ethnic cleansing and mass expulsion of entire populations of civilized peoples. The same individuals who authored the universal human rights language of the post-war order, at the same time they were writing it, were guilty of the most gigantic forced displacement of human beings in the history of the world. Now, there's another mass expulsion that took place in the 20th century, planned and perpetrated by these same good guys, which happened much closer to home. Right now, I'm going to give you guys some numbers from the 1860 census to give you a picture of the state of America 1 year before the start of the Civil War. New Jersey, which is home to the cities of Camden and Newark, was 96% white and 3.8% black. Pennsylvania and Ohio were both 98% white and less than 2% black. Michigan, home to the city of Detroit, 98% white, 0.9% black. Minnesota, where George Floyd was from, 98% white, 0.2% black. New York, 99% white, 1% black. Illinois, home to the great city of Chicago, 100% white. And Wisconsin was also 100% white. Now, I was in Wisconsin with some of you here a few days after last Thanksgiving to protest an anti-white terrorist attack on a Christmas parade. While I was there, I had the opportunity to visit with some comrades in Milwaukee, and I got to reading about the history of that magnificent city, which was once called the German Athens of America. Milwaukee was considered the most German city in the United States, but it also had a huge Polish, Irish, and Italian population. A major port city on Lake Michigan, it was a transportation hub for the grain coming out of the Midwest. It was an industrial powerhouse, but also a major center of culture with an outsized influence on the development of public education in the United States. And also, of course, Milwaukee was world famous for its breweries. In 1910, whites represented 99.7% of the city's total population of about 400,000. As recently as World War II, the black population of Milwaukee was still only 1.5%. By 1950, it was only 3.5%. In 1960, when the population of the city peaked at around 740,000, Milwaukee was still 91% white. But as of the 2020 census, with about 600,000 people, Milwaukee is now only 32% white and 38% black. From 1960 to 2010, the white population of the county surrounding Milwaukee basically tripled, fueling the growth of two places which were very much in the news last year in connection with racial unrest and violence: Waukesha and Kenosha, a place which will forever be connected with the name Kyle Rittenhouse. So what happened to the city of Milwaukee? There are two euphemisms for what essentially destroyed this and dozens of others once great cities in our country. One is something called the Great Migration. The other is known as white flight. The Great Migration is the name given to the movement of over 6 million blacks from the rural South to the cities of the North and West. The vast majority of these blacks came during and after World War II, initially to fill jobs in the booming arms industry for FDR's war of annihilation against Europe. The driving force behind this vast population transfer was a kind of proto-woke capital, the intersection of capitalist greed with a liberal utopian social ideology. At the same time, industrialists and war profiteers plotted to displace white workers with cheap black labor. Liberal ideologues like FDR and his wife Eleanor plotted to break up the concentration of white ethnics in these cities with executive action. In June of 1941, as he was plotting how to get America into the war against the wishes of the American people, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in all federal agencies, companies, and unions engaged in the war effort. And of course, at that time, the war effort just consisted of Lend-Lease, support for the Soviet Union in its war against Germany. This was the first presidential directive on race since Reconstruction, and it was used to create something called the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which used 4 tactics to achieve its goals. 1, providing advice on how to integrate the workplace. 2, giving managers a ready excuse for hiring blacks if whites objected. 3, threatening to bring more powerful federal agencies into the fray on the side of the FEPC. And 4, publicly embarrassing firms or unions that refuse to hire blacks. This was necessary because white people on the ground opposed this mass replacement everywhere it was done to them. Today, this history is forgotten, or at most written off as the ugly racism of our past, as if white people living in the cities they built didn't have a right to be upset with the arrival of hundreds of thousands of members of another race suddenly crammed into their living space. This was just the beginning. In May of 1943, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9346, which gave the FEPC independent status within the office of the president. It established 16 regional offices and widened its jurisdiction to all federal agencies. Now, this is from a quote. This is a quote from a book about this committee. Continuing tensions in cities that were booming with increased populations for the defense industries erupted in race riots in 1943 in Detroit, Los Angeles, Mobile, Alabama, and Beaumont, Texas. In each city, new populations were competing for jobs and housing, and expectations were rising among African Americans to share in the wartime boom. In many places, white workers were resisting this change. In the Detroit Packard plant, 25,000 white workers walked off the job in 1943 when 3 blacks were promoted to work next to whites in the assembly line. The FEPC worked to avoid such hate strikes and help employers manage integration and to negotiate settlements in cases where strikes did take place. In 1946, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9808, which created a President's Committee on Civil Rights. Now, this was 1 year after Truman authorized the dropping of atomic bombs against 2 cities packed with hundreds of thousands of civilians in Japan, and 2 years before Truman became the first world leader to officially recognize the State of Israel, 11 minutes after Israel was created. On the recommendation of this new Civil Rights Committee, Truman proposed to establish a permanent Civil Rights Commission, a joint congressional committee on civil rights, a civil rights division in the Department of Justice, and a permanent Fair Employment Practice Commission. The report from this committee also recommended the UN Charter from 1945 could be used as a source of law to fight racial discrimination in the U.S. Truman later ordered the desegregation of the entire federal workforce and the armed services, and this was followed by a slew of executive orders from Truman and his successors, which established the practice of affirmative action. Shortly thereafter came Brown versus the Board of Education. President Eisenhower, who was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of German POWs from starvation and exposure under his watch only a few years before, now deployed paratroopers of the 101st Airborne to force the integration of public schools at gunpoint. So in every case, you see how it was these same war criminals operating under the same liberal ideology, directed by the same forces behind the scenes, who forced this great replacement on American whites. By the time of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, the way was already paved for top-down government enforcement of racial integration by both the executive and judicial branch against white workers and against white families. What happened to Milwaukee was the same thing that happened in cities all over America. On the local level, whites resisted with all their power the displacement of their communities by this dark racial golem being mobilized against them by the rich and by the powerful. But ultimately their resistance was ground down by forces more powerful than them. The same forces which partitioned India, which created the Jewish state, and which exterminated the Germans of Eastern Europe. And by the way, the assault on the white population of Wisconsin and Michigan continues. Headlines from the past week announced Michelle Obama's brother and his wife are suing a Milwaukee private school for alleged racial bias, and rioters are mobilizing in Grand Rapids over the death of an immigrant from the Congo who was killed by a police officer as he attempted to take control over the officer's taser. What happened to white cities over the past half-century wasn't a migration. It was a mass expulsion. It wasn't simply that blacks drifted into areas that were uninhabited. They were forced in to what were already the most heavily populated areas of the United States, and whites were forced out by the heavy hand of the state in collusion with the relentless propaganda of the mass media. This evil process of ethnic cleansing was accelerated by what the late Sam Francis described as anarcho-tyranny. Not only did working-class urban whites have to deal with court rulings, executive orders, and state violence crushing opposition, but above all, they had to deal with the criminal violence of the blacks themselves, which in the 1960s flared up to consume whole cities in hundreds of deadly riots. The assassination of King became the pretext for mass racial violence by blacks on an unprecedented scale, which caused a trickle into a flood of white families leaving the cities that their grandparents had built. Working-class whites were caught between the organized tyranny of the state on the one hand and the mob violence of the blacks on the other. Those who fought back went to prison or were killed. Those who would not or could not were simply forced out. This is what is called white flight. This term is presented as though average whites were so racist that they just couldn't bear to look at brown skin or kinky hair, that their sensibilities were so delicate, and they found this aesthetic so viscerally distasteful that they would uproot entire communities and abandon their cities just to have to not look at it. In fact, what those whites were fleeing was violence against themselves and against their children. The record of black racial violence is indisputable and has been exhaustively documented by investigative reporters such as the late Colin Flaherty and others. In response, the ADL has declared that the number 13, when used in conjunction with the number 50, is a numeric hate symbol. But I repeat, what is described as the Great Migration was actually the mass expulsion of millions of white people from their own cities. Now, how many millions, I can't say, because for all the academic lamentation over white flight as a symptom of racism, talk about victim blaming, it has been made extremely difficult to get any kind of idea of the overall numbers. This should actually be the subject of a major book. Part of the problem is that many white communities were displaced more than once. An area becomes black and whites are forced out. Then the blacks spread to that new area and whites are forced out again. Countless white families have experienced this. But the results of this mass expulsion speak for themselves. Baltimore was 80% white and 20% black in 1940. Today, Baltimore is 30% white and 62% black. In 1940, Gary, Indiana was 82% white and 18% black. Now Gary, Indiana is 15% white and 78% black. In 1940, Cleveland was 90% white and 10% black. Now Cleveland, Ohio is 49% black and only 34% white. St. Louis, Missouri was 87% white and only 13% black in 1940. Now St. Louis is only 42% white. In 1940, Detroit was 91% white and 9% black. In 1940, now Detroit is 15% white and almost 80% black. Now remember, Detroit was once one of the greatest cities in America, and it was once called the Paris of the Midwest. And these cities weren't just built by whites. Cities are major choke points of political and economic power, not to mention the most important social and cultural hubs of civilization. How much easier is it to hold a mass meeting in the city where everyone can walk or take public transportation versus the country or the suburbs where one must drive miles and then find a place to park? How much easier is it to canvass, petition, or hand out leaflets to thousands of people in a few days in the city, while to reach the same number may take weeks or months in the country or the suburbs? Cities also have public spaces, such as parks and plazas, where suburbs only have private shopping malls where political organizing is impossible. Like online spaces such as Twitter, shopping malls and supermarkets are privately owned, so they can deplatform anyone at any time. And this has huge ramifications for political organizing in places where shopping malls and supermarkets are the only location you can find large numbers of white people gathered together. Believe me, I've experienced this many times firsthand. And think how the black domination of these cities tips the balance of political power in the United States. States like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania are considered swing states, not because the vast majority of descendants of those who settled and worked the land there don't think and feel as one people, but because they have a massive demographic counterweight wedged into the largest population centers of their territory. This completely unbalances the political power in the United States, fragmenting the influence of whites and concentrating the influence of blacks, who are still only 13% of the population. The suburbanization of formerly close-knit inner-city white communities has led to the alienation of whites from each other, the increase of social atomization, the breakdown of social trust and cohesion, the death of organic, folkish culture. We always hear about the vibrancy of inner-city black culture. Well, in the suburbs, folk culture is replaced by corporate mass culture and consumerism, and this also was centrally planned and carried out. And I can hardly touch on the unimaginable environmental destruction and devastation that has been caused and is being caused by the endless spread of urban sprawl as a direct result of having the inner cities taken over and destroyed by blacks. Now, since 2020, we've been living through a new wave of black terror and violence unlike anything ever seen since the 1960s. Mass shootings are common, but to these have been added car ramming attacks, innocent people pushed in front of subways, random beatings, and worse. This black crime wave is so out of hand that the FBI recently announced they would no longer be releasing crime statistics. And if the state apparatus was working hard to destroy white communities in the past, in the last 2 or 3 years, it has ramped up to Stalin-esque proportions. This reign of terror is being enabled by social media companies bent on total anti-white censorship, by television, music, and movie studios who have decided to completely replace whites with blacks in advertising, media, and even in European historical dramas. And it's happening because a new generation of radical prosecutors funded by George Soros and other Jewish oligarchs now routinely refuse to charge black criminals for the crimes they commit, while working overtime to punish and imprison whites who defend themselves, white women who simply call the police for help, as well as those few white policemen still attempting to do their duty. Now, the Declaration of Independence lists one of the 27 grievances justifying revolution against King George as thus: he has excited domestic insurrections against us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. I can't think of a better description for the mode of life of modern urban American blacks. Think of the tragedy of the over 2 million northern whites who served in the Union Army to free the slaves during the Civil War, only to have their home states invaded by those same blacks in later decades, unleashed by big government and big business on their descendants. Think of the hundreds of thousands of white men who were drafted and pushed by the lying Roosevelt administration into bombs and machine guns fire on the beaches of Normandy, onto European battlefields, only to come back only to come back and watch their cities burned and destroyed by black mobs in the 1960s. Think of the tens of thousands of white kids groped, beaten, and tortured by blacks in the integrated public schools, the hundreds of thousands of white women raped by blacks, something like 40,000 a year, and the hundreds of innocent white people horribly killed by pitiless blacks in random acts of violence every year. Think of the injustice of billions of dollars of taxes paid by white workers, by white labor, to support lazy, rude, stupid, unqualified affirmative action hires, and to support a Justice Department that spends every hour plotting and finding new ways to uproot white communities from their own communities. We are forced to pay for our own displacement and destruction. None of us were asked about this. None of us voted for this. In fact, every expression of public outrage or resistance to this ethnic cleansing was forcibly suppressed by the government. Now, something very odd that you'll notice about Black Lives Matter, to the extent that it is an actual movement and not just a corporate slogan, is that it makes no territorial demands. It's because this movement doesn't exist to secure any kind of actual independence or sovereignty for Black Americans as a people. BLM, like critical race theory, exists to do one thing: to grind and squeeze more concessions out of whites through myths of collective guilt, and to cow and terrorize white communities through collective punishment, state violence, and mob violence. They don't only want your cities and your living space, they also want unrestricted access to your lives and your property, the ability to prey on you or your children at will and face no consequences, and they want the power to use the state to crush any whites who defend themselves or who resist. They want to pull down your statues and symbols, deface your history, force you to live in perpetual shame and fear, and they want to rob you while they're doing it. They want to keep taking the fruits. They want to keep taking the fruits of your labor forever and ever. This is what BLM is really about and what critical race theory is really about. Now, back in the early days of the alt-right, when people theoretically speculated about the possibility of a future white ethno-state, system reporters and academics would always object on the grounds that such a thing could never be achieved without violence. Well, that's rich coming from these people. This entire system was created by violence and is maintained by violence. Brutal mass violence against innocent people is the preferred method of the war criminals who brought this condition into being. State violence and mob violence was the only way integration could be achieved. Millions of whites were expelled from their own cities because of violence, and millions more in places like Waukesha today live in fear of racial violence against themselves and their children. We have to stop thinking of this as a migration or white flight. This was a deliberate mass expulsion, organized and carried out from the top down, and we have to recognize it as such when we formulate our demands. And our demands are right there in the National Justice Party platform. We want the same protections granted by the civil rights laws applied to white people. We demand that the labor of working white men and women not be exploited to support a black welfare class or a corrupt anti-white bureaucracy. Likewise, we don't want to exploit blacks in any way. We don't want or need anything from blacks. But we demand an end to the state terror of the FBI and the Jewish Department of Justice in the war against whites. Put simply, our demand is not one more white victim of black crime. Not one! One victim is too many. One victim is too many. The system has no moral ground to stand on. The same system and the same individuals who perpetrated the mass expulsion of whites from American cities are also guilty of the worst war crimes of all time. But we didn't lose a war. We fought all your wars, and we won your wars for you. So why is this happening to us? I tell you, in the name of Travis and of Greg McMichael, in the name of Ian Cranston, in the name of Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom, in the name of Christy Spicuzza, and in the name of Jackson Sparks, we're not going to put up with this for much longer!